Okay, so we move into the last part of this lecture. We began with French realism, proceeded to how realism bloomed and developed in Britain, and then in this part we will revisit the French literary scene post Flaubert, where a new branch of realism developed, where a new offshoot of realistic methodology developed, realistic literary writing developed, and we call that naturalism. There is no much difference. If you look at these two practices closely, you wouldn't find that in execution they are not very different, but they are absolutely contrary in their philosophies. One thing is that 20 years later, Flaubert comes up with his masterpiece in 1857. 2 years later, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, which sets off a whole lot of controversies all across Europe. And then there have been accumulating evidences for Darwin's theory of natural selection. And including Auguste Comte, there are several philosophers in France working, seeking to identify all branches of humanities with a certain scientific rigor. In fact, science became the key term for the latter half of 19th century. As Michel Foucault would later show us, almost all scientific disciplines that rule us now, including sociology and economics, developed as a full-fledged branch in late 19th century France. So this is the context that we are talking about. Naturalism developed against this particular context, and it could not escape the burden of scientificity. So to be scientific, to be objective, to be descriptive, and most of all to be Darwinian was the project of naturalism. It now seems spurious to tie together a way of writing novels with a way of scientific inquiry as objective and as factual as Darwinian theory of natural selection. So it is in fact interesting to see how these two ideas were dovetailed together in 19th century by a major practitioner of naturalism, perhaps the sole practitioner of naturalism and the one who wrote a manifesto for it, Émile Zola. So Zola's practice of naturalistic fiction, his way of politicizing it, also publicizing it, that's very important because by the time we look at Zola's writing getting popular, we see that he is writing in a France which is very different from the France that Flaubert was writing for. It was possible for writers to earn their living by publishing, which wasn't really the scene when Stendhal or Balzac or Flaubert was writing. So by the time 19th century came to a close, in 1887 for that matter, when Émile Zola started appearing on the scene, in 1880 he gives his monumental manifesto, the experimental novel, where he describes certain principles of naturalism, where he tries to show how destiny is basically an evolutionary principle. So these kinds of ideas, which he knew would basically capture the attention of the audience at the turn of the century, and he develops a project. He develops a grand project, in fact perhaps the grandest project in the history of French literature or European literature for that matter. He tries to show you how the saga, the chronicle of an extended family, would basically prove truths of heredity and thereby ratify something like natural selection. Now this seems very a trick that is very difficult to pull off, and that is where the creative genius of Zola needs to be acknowledged. That is why the creative genius of Zola needs to be acknowledged. Naturalism, in fact, as I have told before, as I have told in the beginning, naturalism was trying to extend the possibilities and techniques and methods used by realists before them. But naturalism especially thought that none of the experiences that human beings go through, literally none, including defecation and graphic sexuality, none of this experience merits to be outside literary text. A literary text should be as objective to the reality of human life as science does. Like how science doesn't take sentimental views about human realities. Science doesn't really bother if you cut up a dead body. Science doesn't really bother about examining sexuality. Science doesn't bother about understanding filth of human body. So in the same manner, literary practitioners also were supposed to be completely impartial, objective, descriptive and factual about the way they deal with human realities. By default, therefore, you would find in Emile Zola's works lurid details of explicit sexuality. You would also find him describing the filth on the streets as well as human filth in a very diligent manner. Why he would actually relish the descriptions of these elements is that philosophically, or according to his manifesto, it is that he was trying to take literature closer to the scientific impassion, scientific unsentimentality, scientific distancing for that matter. So he was trying to bring to literature, he was trying to bring to realism what realism should ideally be. If you are trying to depict reality, you must depict reality as science would depict it. One of the major influences on Zola was, of course, the philosopher Auguste Comte. So Auguste Comte would basically argue in favor of science, in favor of the descriptive nature of scientific methodology, and putting that together with literary writing. Emile Zola would basically say that writing must in fact ratify scientific objectivity, scientific methodology. In that line, we should also talk about Frank Norris, another naturalistic writer. Norris's practice was also in line with Zola's ideas of depicting human life, using stark images, using explicit vocabulary, and barring no experience from entering fictional or literary landscapes. So this is the beginning of naturalism, and unfortunately this is also the end of naturalism, because as a principle it was really attractive and it did really capture the attention of the audience, but in popularity Emile Zola had to fight his predecessors, and Emile Zola found it very difficult to market the kind of writing that he was advocating. He always have had very acerbic critics taking him to task. It was not possible for Emile Zola to establish himself as a writer of the establishment during his lifetime, even though his novels like Thérèse Raquin, Germinal, Nana, even though they are considered to be classics of world literature, we would still find that Flaubert or Stendhal or Balzac would still would definitely be counted as better writers. Despite the fact that Zola through Nana or through Thérèse Raquin or Germinal was trying to better their methodology. Journalism or journalistic way of writing, the descriptive emphasis on depicting details, this was the forte of realist writing. Zola would take journalism, he would actually upgrade journalism to scientific writing. A journalist would report the fact. A journalist is not circumscribed by any philosophical framework. There is no philosophical destiny to which a journalist is aspiring. But for Zola, he is aspiring towards, he is writing towards the realization of a certain scientific philosophy. He is trying to show how heredity, he is trying to show how natural selection, he is trying to show how the Darwinian framework can be ratified through literature. I mean, when he is writing about this extended family, as I was trying to refer in the beginning, the entire series of novels that he has come up with, this grand body of work that he has come up with, essentially relates to a few characters in a certain family, their fortunes, their misfortunes, their going up in the society, coming down in the society, their fallen status, their promises that they rise. So all those things together, he was trying to say how the society is in fact Darwinian. Now this is working like a scientist. The novelist is actually working like a scientist, and he was trying to put together the philosophy of naturalism as something that can be aligned with the then popular views of Darwin, and maybe we should also look at it from a commercial angle. I mean, apart from the scientific vigor that we are discussing here, there is also this commercial angle that mingles with Zola's writing. Zola needed to unlike Flaubert, unlike Balzac, unlike Stendhal, Zola needed to make his living by selling his books. He wasn't an aristocrat. He did not work, in journalistic fields. He did not earn his revenue. His revenue, his livelihood was basically from the novels he would sell. So he needed that to be sold. And the turn of the century French crowd was so eager for novels, for realist novels, that it was possible for Émile Zola, if he had a marketing plan, he could actually sell his novels well. And naturalism was in many ways later identified by critics like George Levine would say that Émile Zola did not even write a naturalist novel. He was trying to publicize his realist novels under the label of naturalism. This is one observation that George Levine would make later in 20th century. Maybe there is some truth in what Levine is trying to tell us, because if you look at Nana, a novel by Émile Zola, for instance, you would see that the novel is constructed as luridly realistic. But this lurid realism does not ratify more than a certain extent the Darwinian theories. In fact, in that case, Red and Black by Stendhal, for instance, could be called Darwinian. So there is a way in which Zola was using publicity for his books. So there are two angles through which naturalism needs to be perspectivized. One is that it aspired to be totally scientific. The other is that it banked heavily on the contemporary capitalist background. The emerging book market was one of the major stooges against which naturalism developed. Naturalism is in fact the turn of the century movement which brought the realist movement, which brought the realist wave to the attention of the mass reading public, which emerged at the turn of the century. Middle class now required more material for reading, and there was this huge women population who had acquired literacy and was in search of books that they could use for leisure time reading. And Émile Zola, through his depiction of again characters from lower middle class and working class, he did take sides with the common man. He did take sides with that section of population which was now emerging into the mass readership. So the way in which his novels are set would basically tell us how the fortunes of the fortunes of a low class or a lower middle class or a peasant character needs to be looked at as shaped by historical destiny or scientific destiny, to use his own formulation, his own phrasing. Now, most of the time, the characters in a naturalist novel, whether it be of Norwich or Zola, most of the time the characters at the end of the novel wouldn't be much different from the beginning of the novel. In a realist novel, what happens is there is a gradual evolution of a character. The plot would be evolving. But in naturalism, this evolution is held at a minimum scale. You are shown that the character goes through a lot of ups and downs, but the character doesn't change much. There is no moral deterioration or moral upliftment by the time the plot ends, because, as I was trying to say earlier, there is a certain determinism at work. I mean, heredity is the thing that determines your attitudes. It's not society that determines your attitude. It's not context that determines your attitude. It is not psychology that determines your attitude. It is basically heredity that determines your attitude. And if it is heredity, if it is genetic, if it is inherited, there is nothing that could really change a character. So this is also a core philosophy that naturalism was trying to expound. In naturalist novels, you would find that characters are held at a limbo. Events are happening, things are happening to them, things are whirling their fortunes around, but still the essential attitudes of the character remains the same. So this is another feature that you would identify in the case of a naturalist novel, and in that sense it distinguishes itself starkly from, and in that point it distinguishes itself from a realist novel, which would essentially be a moral narrative. I mean, look at Madame Bovary for that matter. In Madame Bovary, you would find that the disillusionment of Bovary is a very important component of the moral system of the novel. Whereas in Nana or in Teres Raquin or Germinal, you wouldn't have that kind of a moral narrative running along with the plot. This is one important aspect of naturalist fiction. Naturalist fiction developed in France. In very many ways, you can think of B.S. Lawrence, using so many techniques, so many literary conventions, so many literary conventions, literary devices of naturalist writing can be found in B.H. Lawrence's works, especially Lady Chatterley's Lava. You would find that Lawrence moves towards naturalist writing. You can have other, in other places of the world. Look at U.S. for instance. In American literature, you have Faulkner's early short stories are usually called naturalistic. Especially Rose for Emily is seen as a classic case of a naturalist writing, where you have a woman who kills her lover, and this murder is described in great detail. The motive is described in Darwinian manner. So Faulkner is sometimes taken as a naturalist writer. Of course, Faulkner changes. Faulkner moves into modernism, high modernism, and stream of consciousness later in his career. But his early short stories essentially show a naturalistic strain. In the same manner, Stephen Crane, another American writer, shows a naturalistic strain in his short stories. So with this handful of writers, this brief interval of naturalism comes to an end, and even though realism continues to flourish, even though realism as a mode of writing continues to flourish, naturalism as a revolutionarily scientific method of expressing literary ideas, expressing literary notions, that comes to an end by the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, naturalism by default, naturalism very obviously gives way to the experimental tendencies that you would associate with modernism. Naturalism, as such, was an experimental project, and naturally, the formal experiments which were so crucial to the development of modernism would spring out of it. So, with that, we would wind up the discussion of realism and naturalism at that. What the major things that we need to keep in mind is realism is not always about the real that we perceive around us. Realism is like any other school of writing mode of representation. Naturalism, which followed it, was trying to take this mode of representation into its extremes, into its logical extremes. But yes, naturalism was a fleeting phenomenon. Realism, on the other hand, continued to be prominent in European fiction.